The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Unyte Group, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. Hope you're all well. Winding down towards the end of this year, it's been snowing in the UK, which has been nice. I've had more than a few snowballs thrown at me by my wonderful children. Nice to have something a bit Christmassy though towards the end of the year, so hope you're all doing well. Big news this week was about Brittany Griner. For those that don't know, Brittany is one of the best American women's basketball players who was playing for a club in Russia. She was caught with some medical cannabis vapes and arrested and imprisoned for cannabis possession. She spent best part of 9 months, I think, in prison and was actually even sent to a penal colony about a month or two ago. Russia was clearly using her as a political pawn and successfully managed to secure a prisoner swap with a notorious arms dealer called Victor Bout, affectionately known as the Merchant of Death. I mean, firstly, it's good news for Brittany and her family that she's home now, but it's been interesting to see the reaction in the industry to her release. Her crimes cannot be compared to Bout's, so her release has certainly come at a cost. It's also shone a light on who else wasn't swapped and whether celebrity helped Brittany's cause. And most importantly for the cannabis industry, how come the US government is prepared to swap an extremely dangerous criminal in order to release someone for cannabis possession in a foreign country, yet many tens of thousands still languish in US jails for the very same crime? There's a significant movement around the cannabis prisoner release program in the US, so let's see where this goes. I don't think Brittany Griner has spoken yet, but we'll also be interested to see whether she becomes a more active advocate for cannabis because of her experiences. Once again, this episode is sponsored by our good friends at Lumino. We are talking about industrial hemp today. Lumino have great experiences recruiting for agricultural and commercial roles, anything from agronomists to commercial leads that can take products to market. They're always happy to chat, the nicest people I know in the industry. So, as always, if you need any help with HR or recruitment, please do get in touch with them at luminorecruit.com, and obviously mention my name when you do. Now, on with the show. Enjoy. On today's show, I have Mike Morgan-Giles and Jamie Bartley, both representing the UK Cannabis Industry Council, which is the leading organisation in the UK representing the whole cannabis industry. Guys, welcome. How you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Anish.
Good to have you on. Going to be talking about hemp, one of my favourite topics and one that I unfortunately don't get a chance to cover as much as I'd like. Loads of stuff, and obviously it's very relevant with all the sustainability talk that is going on at the moment. So, lots to get into. I'd like to start with the bit about both of you first, though, on an individual basis. If you can just sort of introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your background and how you got into this space. Mike, do you want to kick off first?
Yeah, thanks, Anish. So I'm fairly new to the sector. I've been CEO of the Cannabis Industry Council since August. Before that, I worked for a few different membership organisations in water, energy, education and local government. So quite an eclectic mix. Most of those roles are in PR, marketing and government engagement, which obviously is all very important to the council. I suppose my one bit of background where I do have some connection to drugs policy was I wrote my dissertation on drug policy reform quite some time ago. So did a few interviews with various people across the space, and that formed part of my sort of final year. But that was quite a long time ago. It was back in 2006.
Right. Thank you. That's brilliant, Mike. We'll talk a bit about the CIC in a second. Jamie, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself as well now?
Yeah, certainly, Anish. So my name's Jamie Bartley. I'm the CEO of the Unyte Group. Within the Unyte Group, we're quite a diverse group of companies covering various sectors from construction, waste management, energy and retrofit, but more specifically for today's conversation, we've got a hemp business and we've also got a medical cannabis business. And we're the largest UK licence holders for industrial hemp cultivation. We have 5 licences covering 1,700 acres in total. And we've also undertaken 240 acres of research cultivation over 3 years. really trying to generate as much data and robust information as possible to allow the hemp industry to scale here in the UK and globally.
Fantastic. And what part do you play in the CIC?
Within the CIC, my role is I'm chair of the Hemp Working Group subgroup, and we also sit on the executive board there as well. And that's really just trying to ensure that across all of the elements that we represent within the CIC, that there's a fair and equal voice for all of the various pillars that fall within the sector overall.
Brilliant, thank you. And all three of us were at the all-party parliamentary group last week at the House of Commons, which was always interesting. Maybe, actually, Mike, do you want to talk a bit about the Cannabis Industry Council and what you guys are up to there?
Yeah, sure. So, our role at the APPG is that both Jamie and I attend regularly the meetings for it itself, and also we participate in the Secretariat Advisory Board, which is a group of like-minded trade bodies who all kind of collaborate together to try and help the APPG's sort of move its agenda forward. So that's one part of what we do. And Crispin Blunt, who's the MP who leads that APPG, is on our executive committee as well. So that's sort of one part of it. But in terms of the CIC ourselves, since I joined, we've recently developed a vision and mission. So that's sort of very important to where we're going forward. So our vision is to improve access to cannabis to enhance people's health, the environment and the economy. So that's sort of how we want to, everything we do, we want to see it in that sort of context. And so the role of the association, as we see it, is to lead the industry to success and enable it to speak with one voice. So that for us is how we want to go about things. But what we're doing at the moment is, though, we've obviously got the working groups, and Jamie's spoken about the hemp one. We've got a very, very active prescription cannabis working group, which is, working on various outputs. And likewise, we've got a standards working group, which also is working. It's got a lot of members there too. And we've just created a CBD working group as well, which we hope will help to represent that part of the sector. We've got a lot of other things going on as well. We've just created a whole range of new member benefits. We're hoping to run an annual conference next year. And we've got a new fee structure as well to make it a bit more easier for people to join in these sort of challenging economic times. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of what we're doing as an organisation. But I suppose some of our key work, we can come on to the hemp bit, obviously, that Jamie will talk more about. But we want to do a project next year with Drug Science and the University of York, looking at how cannabis can be prescribed more widely on the NHS, and how we think that will be cost neutral. So we think that'll be a really important project that we hope to kick off really soon. And we also did an important piece of research recently with Drug Science on the importance of real world evidence in a sort of a alternative and an addition to clinical trials, just trying to broaden out the evidence that people use to understand how cannabis can really help people. So that's something else which is really important for us. So quite a lot going on. And we've also got a all-member meeting in January where we've got the head of novel foods at the FSA speaking. So that's something else that we're, opening up to members to try and, enable them to speak to regulators and really try and move the agenda forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, I support all of that. And it's always traditionally been quite a tricky thing to pull all the various stakeholders in these sort of fledgling industries, not single industry, but to pull them together. But it seems that you guys are doing a good job of it, and there's lots of different areas to tackle. So I wish you all the best with that. Today, we're going to talk very specifically about hemp. So great to have Jamie here because he's the absolute expert on this. And Mike, feel free to chip in here, but I'll probably direct a lot of these questions to Jamie. So, the title of the show is Hemp, Environmental Saviour. We're all hoping it is. So where do we start here? Maybe, Jamie, you can sort of lay out some of the sort of environmental credentials of hemp.
Yeah, certainly, Anuj. There are, and you're right, where do we start? I think if we start with probably the biggest win with hemp is the carbon side, it's carbon sequestration properties. So it's one of the fastest growing biomass that we can grow in agricultural land or on poor quality brownfield land as well. Hemp will grow pretty much in any land other than deserts. But when it does grow, because of how quickly it grows, and that's potentially some cultivars will go up to 3, maybe 4 and a bit meters tall. Some of the Chinese cultivars will even go to 6.5 meters tall. And that's in its sort of 3 to 4 month growth cycle. And that means because of the biomass it produces, it sequesters lots of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere during its growth. And then that's stored in the biomass of the hemp, so the above ground biomass, the straw, and also below ground in the soil biome and the root rhizome. And actually 60% of the carbon activity or the carbohydrate activity, and therefore the sequestered carbon, is found to be in the soil rather than in the above ground biomass. So that's probably its big environmental win, but there's lots of other benefits too. So hemp, when it grows in fields, doesn't need any pesticides or insecticides, and most soils quite often not even any fertilizers as well if it's an active organic soil. And so that means you're reducing any of the inputs, which also reduces costs, but it reduces then runoff of those inputs into our groundwater, into our streams and rivers, and further causing additional knock-on costs because they have to be cleaned up for drinking water, but also then causing further environmental impacts on biodiversity. And that brings me on to the next one, really, is because of the lack of pesticides and insecticides, it has a great amount of biodiversity in the fields. And biodiversity, I mean, COP15 is on at the moment and really focused on the biodiversity disaster that we're seeing. So I think incorporating crops that don't need any insecticide or pesticides and also can really improve biodiversity. It's a late season source of pollen for our pollinators and bee populations, for instance. There's very few sources of pollen around in either agricultural fields or even just in wildflowers around the time that hemp would be harvested. So it gives a late season source there to birds as well. Whenever we cultivate near pheasants, where people have pheasant shoots, etc., and gamekeepers, they're always commenting about how plump and happy the pheasants are, and it's because they go around eating all hemp seed out of the hemp. So they get really nutritious seed from there. The other final one is that it can be utilised as a decarbonisation tool or a feedstock in so many multiple different end use sectors. And that way, its diversity also really leads into its environmental benefit as well.
Can you just explain that last bit in terms of what that actually means?
So hemp, when we utilise it, I mean, I refer to it as a feedstock because ultimately it's a material. It's a biomass material that grows in a field and can get harvested in various ways. But then when you look at that feedstock going into lots of different industries to replace quite often petrochemical derived feedstocks or products, and you can replace those with hemp, you're having a massive net effect then on decarbonisation because you're reducing the petrochemicals, you're reducing the need for those because you're replacing them with a biogenic alternate material that can be derived from the hemp. So you always need to process it, and we'll probably come on to some of the barriers around processing a little bit later in the conversation. But it, like any product, like oil, for instance, you don't just suck oil out the ground and it's good to go into multiple different industries. It goes through lots of different layers of processing to then turn into lots of different products, which is then a feedstock for multiple different end use industries. And that's really how we're trying to approach things within the CIC and within Unyte, is that we can utilise hemp as an ideal bio-based feedstock. It can outperform most other bio-based feedstocks on lots of different levels with regards to benefits and yield. So therefore, I think it's absolutely at the top of the tree as a solution.
Fantastic. And I'm not sure if you're going to go on to talk about this, but phytoremediation of the soil, can you explain a bit about how that works as well?
That was one of the reasons I initially started looking at hemp, actually. I've worked for 20 years in contaminated land and waste management, so dealing with poor quality contaminated land and remediating that soil. And my initial research around 8-9 years ago for hemp was around its phytoremedial properties to clean up poor quality contaminated land. It's what they call a hyperaccumulator, which basically means that it can absorb far higher levels of phytotoxic heavy metals that would normally kill off plant growth. So, I mean, it was used actually in Chernobyl to clean up radioactive impacted soils there after the nuclear disaster. And also there was a large research study done in Italy where there was some chromium-6 contamination that had impacted on about 50 hectares of farmland caused by industrial metalworks locally. And chromium-6 is toxic to humans, and it's also quite bioabsorbent by plants. So that means that it can enter the food chain very easily and then have a severe impact on human health. So they couldn't grow any agricultural crops on those fields. They grew hemp on those fields for 3 years in a row, and it cleaned up all of the chromium-6 to levels that they could safely go back into arable crop production for human food consumption. So those were the initial reasons I started looking at it. But then quite quickly, when I was doing my research, realised that there's a myriad of other solutions it could provide to quite timely problems that people were becoming aware of at the time. I mean, microplastics was on everyone's lips at the time, and people were understanding that consumers have an impact on the environment. COP26 was down the road, but on the horizon at the time. So I could see a few different reasons why actually hemp could come back round to being the solution it was for thousands and thousands of years for humanity. It's just we happen to live in the crazy 100-year blip of cannabis prohibition.
Yeah, it is a bit crazy, isn't it? Great. I mean, that Chernobyl story is always the one that I use when I'm sort of explaining one of the virtues of hemp. I'm not sure whether you talked a bit about the food as well in terms of its environmental.
Well, yeah, that's it. I mean, it's two things, two ways that it can help on the food element. So obviously there's a large environmental impact from food production as a whole globally, and we have there's a lot of different research around the emissions from different sectors and productions of different food sources. So the hemp seed produces a really sustainable protein powder and nutritious seed oil as well. So that gives the opportunity, if you store the protein powder, it can give a very high volume of long-term stored protein that then can be used during droughts and to prevent famines, etc. But also from our research, the following crop yields increased by 16 to 18%. So that when you talk about that in a farming perspective, if you're growing a winter wheat or a spring barley after you've grown a crop of hemp in that field, and you suddenly have a 16 to 18% increase in that cash crop, that's a real interesting uplift for farmers.
Why is that? Is that because the soil's cleaned and it's just a bit healthier?
Yes, I think predominantly there's three reasons that we've attributed to it, and that there's further ongoing research that we're looking to undertake in 2023 around this as well. But the main elements are that in the UK, when we harvest the hemp, we have to destroy the flowers and the leaves, and that destruction process is done through retting, which is basically the hemp straw is left in the fields in long windrows and it's turned 2 or 3 times. And that process, and I mean, it is RETT, retting, but it's basically rotting down the flower and the leaf. So, and that then releases all those nutrients and all that nitrogen back into the soil. But also, as I mentioned before, the carbohydrate activity within the root rhizome, which is basically the area below the root plant where its roots, where the hemp plant, where its roots are, all of the interactions between the fungal activity, the protozoal activity, and the microbiome biological activity, all of that improves the soil texture and composition. And also, because hemp's got quite a large root mass, it actually breaks up overly compact soils. So that improves the aeration for the soil, and it improves attenuation, so the water holding capacity of the soil as well. Both of those two elements also lead on to having a healthier following crops, because they can get more air, they can get more nutrients accessible to their roots. And also because hemp's taproot is quite a lot longer than most other crops that would be going in an agricultural field, it draws up the micro and macronutrients from deeper in the soils, which the normal crops can't reach, and brings them back up to the near surface subsoils and topsoils, which is where they're accessible to the following crops.
Wow. Love it. I love these facts. Amazing. Thank you, Jamie. So we'll talk a bit about maybe some of the industries that hemp can play a part in. Just quickly to talk about it, how does it compare to cannabis, environmentally? Because, I take in the US where you've got a kind of recreational market out of use, it's not very environmentally friendly from everything that I see and I read.
No, absolutely, Nish. I mean, there was one report I was reading from the US that 4.7 tons of carbon is emitted for 1 kilogram of production of cannabis. 4.7 tons of carbon for 1 kilogram. So absolutely. I mean, I think there is a lot that could be done to solve that. It's about using renewable energy to grow your indoor cultivated cannabis, if that's certainly decarbonising it. But yes, I mean, that is a big difference. It's the energy consumption needed for generally cannabis cultivation. If it's done indoors in controlled environments, then that has a high level of energy consumption due to the lights, due to the HVAC systems, etc. Whereas hemp, it grows in fields, it grows with rainwater and sunshine. It doesn't have any inputs at all in most locations. So, I mean, it's far, far more sustainable crop. And it's sucking up to circa 32 tonnes per hectare of carbon out of the atmosphere during its growth, rather than emitting 4.7 tonnes per kilo. So, I mean, if you worked that 4.7 tonnes and worked out how many actual kilos of hemp you're producing per hectare compared to the alternative, it would be astronomical numbers. So that's the main difference between the two, is that you don't need any of those energy consumptions to cultivate hemp. What I would say, though, and it's worth considering, that to produce products from hemp, you do then usually need quite high levels of energy, because it's a very robust crop. So you do need to have quite specialist equipment and quite large scale equipment to commercially manufacture different end use products.
Yeah, it's never that straightforward, is it? So yeah, getting onto the sectors that that hemp can sort of play a sustainable role in? I mean, the most obvious one to me is construction, which is obviously, you're quite involved in, but textiles and food. Maybe you can talk a bit about, what sectors you see it could disrupt potentially.
Certainly, I mean, and to be honest, I quite often say to people, you tell me the sector you're in and I'll tell you how it can have a positive, disruptive impact in your sector. And unless you're in the petrochemical sector, it's pretty much, I haven't found one that it can't have a positive impact on. But the main ones, I mean, our focus, as you mentioned there, is initial construction. And the rationale behind that is, one, I've got 15 years experience working in construction, but two, it emits 40% of our UK carbon emissions annually. So it's a massive emitter of carbon from within the UK. It's also a huge sector. We're not going to stop building anytime soon. There's a need for housing. There's a huge need for retrofitting our existing housing stock to reduce people's fuel bills, to reduce the overall nation's energy requirements. So construction absolutely is a key sector that we're focused on. And that's because we can replace high body carbon products with carbon negative products or low carbon products, depending on the life cycle analysis and the processing that's been used. But take, for instance, a rock wool insulation. You mine rock out of the ground with huge plant and equipment. You then crush that rock with huge plant equipment. You then heat that rock up to 1700 degrees Celsius in a kiln. You then fibrillate it into fibres. You turn it into a rock wool insulation mat, and then you go and put that in a house. And at the end of the lifespan of the house, you have to landfill it because there's no other option to recycle it. So you look at that huge amount of emissions during all that process compared to, as I described a minute ago, the lack of energy needed to cultivate the hemp, and then also the carbon that's sequestered during that cultivation time, and the carbon that's in the hemp biomass is locked up into the house too. So it's an absolute win-win when you're looking at construction materials. But I do think this will be used for lots of other sectors. We've covered food a little bit there. I think nutritious food oil and protein powder absolutely will see a growth in that sector, and we already are. And we'll also see, I mean, I think one of the big textiles is coming, but there's also, we've offshored so much of our historic textile production in the UK. So there's a lot of pieces of technology that, for instance, around spinning and weaving that we haven't got because those have been sold to other countries. So textiles will come back online. I still see textiles being a slightly international supply chain in the interim, but we're working with a few companies on really looking at trying to scale UK hemp textile supply chains at the moment.
And just on the textiles piece, I think, a lot of people, maybe a bit older, but kind of think of hemp clothing as sort of scratchy and hippie and 70s. And I'm assuming that modern production methods now have kind of overcome some of those issues that hemp clothing and material would have suffered from.
Yeah, 100%, Liz. You're spot on. It historically, it was quite rough, and that comes down to it's quite a stiff fibre. It has lots of pectin and lignin in the fibres, which are the natural glues, and that also adds to the stiffness. It's one of the reasons it's a very high tensile strength fibre as well. So there's a few different technologies that come forwards, one of them being a company who's got a patented technology to cottonize the hemp fibre. So that takes raw hemp fibre and it puts it through this process, which will then cottonize the fibre so it can then be treated like a cotton fibre or a wool fibre and spun into yarns and has very soft feelings. I got married in a 100% hemp suit. So I think there are absolutely products out there that are far softer. I've got quite a few of what I'd call a coarser hemp shirt, etc. And actually they do, within a few washes, they do soften up as well quite nicely. So even if something might feel a little bit coarse to touch, it does soften up fairly quickly, and it's quite hard wear. It's hard wearing fabrics generally. But there's also advancements coming with regards to blending hemp and different fibres, so hemp and nettle, and even some synthetic fibres as well. I mean, those syn fibres, if they're recycled synthetic fibres, again, that's still adding to removing virgin plastics from coming into supply chains. And it means that you can produce far more of the athletic components, for instance, those types of things, the garments for when you're in mountains and in sort of more extreme conditions, so your Gore-Tex type equivalents. So all of those technologies are coming out now, and certainly there's been a lot of R&D, and I think it's like anything. It's the case, once the R&D is done, it then needs the investment into the infrastructure to allow it to scale into any end use that's going to look at hemp. The other big one that I can see it being a large part of is energy, both from a biomass production point of view. We've done various trials with Drax, etc. I'm looking at producing biomass for power station. Obviously, if you have combined carbon capture and underground storage included, then that can be quite a sustainable source of power. But longer term, I see it being bioethanol and green hydrogen.
Jamie, just on that, are you talking about burning the biomass as energy?
So that's what one option would be just fueling biomass power stations. At the moment, we're importing Canadian and North American timber, so shipping it over and burning it. So it's looking at alternative UK supplied sources of biomass potentially. But I think the big ones we'll see emerge, and I think there's a strong opportunity is bioethanol as a sustainable aviation fuel, and also green hydrogen production. So when you ferment normal grain, you get around a 42% yield of bioethanol. When you ferment just the hemp shivs, so just the woody part of the hemp straw, you get a 76% yield of bioethanol because of the sugar levels in the shiv. But then when you also look at how much grain you get per hectare compared to how much shiv you get per hectare, there's a considerable increase there in yield as well. And also the green hydrogen side of things, when you put hemp into anaerobic digestion, for instance, again, because of sugars, you get a very high biogas yield. And you can take that biogas and steam methane reform the biogas to produce hydrogen. So that's another viable way for us to produce a very clean burning fuel source that we're going to see acceleration and uptake of quite a lot. So I do think energy production is another viable sector that hemp will get adopted into.
Wow, that's super interesting. Sorry, Mike, you go.
Yeah, thanks, Anish. I mean, I think, there's so many benefits, and Jamie's talked so eloquently about them, but I think the challenges are just, so massive as well. I mean, the lack of awareness in some of these sectors around the opportunities that there are, and obviously the vested interest as well. I mean, I'm sure if you look at any of these sectors, there'll be large companies there who want to protect the way things have been done for a while, and we've really got to break down those barriers. And obviously also there's, in particular with construction, the sort of the negative perception potentially of cannabis, and the perception that I guess their concern would be more around, not wanting to have workers on building sites who may well have consumed it at some point. And that's probably their very basic perception of cannabis, rather than looking at hemp and seeing all the benefits it can bring. So we've really got to work, as a council and with others to try and break these down as best we can.
Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff I do is around cannabis, and the stigma there is a huge issue. But yeah, I guess hemp all gets lumped in together, right? Regardless whether you're putting it inside your body or you're using it as a material.
Yeah, I think that's it. A lot of people's instant reactions to the word cannabis is still prohibition, reefer madness sort of rhetoric, because that's what they would start to believe. And it's a slightly softer reaction to the word hemp, but it's still that's the hippie thing, and that is probably 90% of people's understanding. There's some conversations going on at the moment around actually what terminology should be used, and my view is that actually if we use the proper terminology, for instance, hemp is Cannabis sativa L, that's its proper botanical name, and obviously it was mentioned in the APPG we were at the other day as well, and hemp is a more accepted word, but actually hemp's just something that diversifies cannabis as a whole and allows people to say I like hemp, I don't like cannabis, or it's all one thing, it's all one plant, and it's the industrial applications of cannabis, or it's the medicinal applications of cannabis. And I had quite a few conversations with Simpa around this, and we both agree that if we could get people to use a proper terminology, we also normalise and break down that instant reaction that people still have, because they go, that's cannabis has been used industrially for building a house or insulating my loft to reduce my energy bill, and that would accelerate the acceptance of all elements and everything that the plant can do to improve human and planetary health. But we've got to get people used to that word and get used to them saying it, and the more we can say it, the better.
Completely. I couldn't agree more. It's funny because when people I haven't seen for a while kind of talk to me, they're like, how's your CBD thing going? Because they're scared to say the word cannabis. It's hilarious. So yeah, I totally get that. So it was really good. Thank you, Mike, as well, for chiming in with that. The stigma issue is, and it will definitely affect lots of your work at the Cannabis Industry Council as well. I mean, a couple of the other ones that I was thinking, especially that affect hemp, are around infrastructure and cost. And Jamie, you referred to that slightly earlier. It's not the easiest crop to deal with and process and all that sort of stuff. Maybe you can go into some of the challenges that exist around that.
Yeah, certainly, Anish. I mean, during our 3 years of trials, we trialled lots of different harvest equipment and technologies, etc. And I've spent many 18-hour days hanging out at the throats of combine harvesters that have got hemp straw wrapped around shafts and have popped massive steel bearings off. And yeah, it's got a tendency. I think one day we broke 3 different balers in one day trying to bale the hemp. I mean, it is a really, really robust crop. And then when you look to do once you've got it into a bale, if you manage to get that far, you need to process it into the primary process is called decortication. And that separates the outer bast fibres that can go into textiles or insulation and the woody chip, the shiv, which is the wood chip core. It separates those 2 fractions, and then you need further processing of those 2 fractions to turn them into whichever products you're going to be manufacturing. Now, depending on what end users you're looking at and what scale, for instance, construction, you need to be doing it at a very large scale to make it cost viable for the mainstream construction sector. Because, yes, they want to build more sustainable houses, but they're not going to double the price of those houses to do it. So for it to be accepted, we need to ensure we're doing it at the right scale. And a number of times I've talked to investors and they've said, this is great, but can't we do it at a little bit smaller scale? Because to do it at the scale that's viable, you need 60 million of investment into the capex, into the equipment and the opex, and you need to be growing 32,000 acres a year as a feedstock. But you'll be sequestering a hell of a lot of carbon, and you can produce 10,600 houses worth of insulation or 5 million hempcrete blocks. But then we can start having an impact in the construction sector. But if we don't do it at that scale, it won't be cost accessible to the mainstream construction sector. And yes, we can go and build single house builds and lots of grand design type properties, but that's what hemp's been used for historically for the last 15, 20 years in the UK. We need to get it into the mainstream sectors and industries, and that way we start having the impact that all of us need to have.
Yeah, I mean, it's that chicken and egg sort of situation, isn't it, really? And so with that in mind, how do you think we get to that place? You know, are you looking at policy, and maybe Mike, you can sort of input here a bit as well, I guess. Are you looking at the policy level? Do we need to subsidize this in some way? What are your sort of solutions to how you can get to that point?
Yeah, I mean, from a policy perspective, we've got to work with colleagues across the industry. So we're speaking to the British Hemp Alliance, for example, and others within the hemp working group around, you know, what key information can we get together? What arguments do we need to put forward to really make the case, and who are the key people we need to get in front of? And I think working with some of the larger construction companies, if we can, to try and explain to them that it's worth, you know, being one of the front runners, being one of the leaders in this, working with organisations like Jamie's, but others, of course, as well, who are in this space, to try and, you know, show that this is viable and it can work, I think is really important. I mean, Jamie can obviously talk more about, you know, what is needed to happen on a more practical level, but we've got to start having those conversations and start putting forward those stats and facts, and really just try and get in front of the right people.
Absolutely. I mean, Mike's been absolutely spot on since he joined us at the council, and have really been progressive in putting together a lot of direction to allow the acceleration and the conversations to be had, because education is a big piece. I think if we can educate people to the solutions and break down the connotations and their reactions to the word, suddenly then they're interested. Quite often, if I'm speaking to people I know are probably going to have a negative reaction to the word cannabis or hemp, I don't use the word at all. And I'll talk to them about solutions to decarbonising and levelling up local economies and decarbonising our residential housing stock and reducing fuel bills and improving biodiversity and following crop yields. And at the end of it, they're like, oh, this is great. I don't know what he was talking about. And then I was talking about cannabis sativa ale, which is industrial hemp. If I'd come over and say, can I talk to you about cannabis, you'd have shut the conversation down. And we've got to lead with the solutions it can provide. And that is what I feel will break down the barriers. And that will also drive the investment, because if the need's there and the want's there, the investment will come too. And once the investment's into the infrastructure, the ball's rolling, and we're through the prohibition blip and into a sensible stage of sustainable development.
Absolutely. And, you know, education is key to this show, key reason for it. And it is about that. But the strategic approach to that, in how you get people to listen, you know, before they put their barriers up, is really important as well. And that's that focusing on solutions is a good way to go about it. So as we just sort of come to the end of the show, yeah, I mean, like we kind of talked a little bit about this, but what are some of the practical changes, maybe on a legal basis? And maybe you could talk about some of the things that are low hanging fruit or achievable, and maybe some of the bigger aims that you might have.
I mean, I think at the moment, one of the main issues, if you like, is that we've got controlled drugs framework in the UK, and cannabis sativa ale hemp sits under that controlled drugs framework under Misuse of Drugs Act. So you need to allow farmers to grow hemp. They have to go to the Home Office Drugs and Firearms Licensing Unit and ask for a license to grow the crop in their fields, which is a bit of a barrier because that puts our farmers off. And it is treated a little bit like a no, you need to convince us why, rather than yes, crack on. This makes sense. So I think there's probably a little bit of a disconnect there in policy, and we are pushing quite hard for DEFRA to potentially look at taking on that role, because DEFRA are used to talking to farmers and understand the agricultural sector in a lot more detail. But ideally, longer term, the need to have a licensing at all would be better to get rid of, because ultimately it's such a low risk. I think the perception is that the flowers are going to get stolen out of fields and go into the black market, which anyone who understands anything to do with hemp will understand that it's a dioecious or a monoecious crop, which means it will have seeds in there. And that means it's got no value in the black market, even if anyone did want to go into fields. And you'd have to get quite a lot of that hemp to have any sort of effects similar to any of the products on the black market. So, I mean, it's just an absolute non-starter, but that is unfortunately one of the misconceptions and one of the beliefs around it, and also that drives some of the licensing requirements. But flowers and leaves, we can't touch the flowers and leaves as UK farmers. That's a bit backwards, if you ask me. We've got a 400 million legal CBD industry in the UK. All of that CBD is imported from Europe, from the US, from China, from countries which have less controls than some of ours. And it all could be produced from UK farmers if we could extract the biomass and use the flowers and the leaves. So I think there is a few disconnects that could be changed quite quickly, and actually achieve some economic growth for the country too, and increase some taxes and provide some further jobs, all the things which the government is in desperate need to do.
Yeah, I mean, that is maddening, the issue around production of CBD in the UK. I mean, the analogy is always, growing an apple tree for the wood and throwing away the apples, it's a bit insane, isn't it? Guys, I mean, this has been really, really brilliant, and I love all the facts. So I'm going to try and kind of jot down some of these and push them out when I push the show out as well. But I think we need to sort of wrap it up now. But I just want to say huge thanks to you. We could have really talked for a lot longer, because there's loads more we could go into. But it'd be great to have you guys both back on the show at some point.
Yeah, absolutely, Anuj.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, let's come on any time. And keep doing what you're doing, Anuj. It's great stuff. It's what everyone needs: education, keep the conversations, and that's what we'll all get there eventually.
Appreciate it, mate. Thank you. Cool. Take care, guys.
Cheers, guys.
You too. Thanks.